2021, and in this big bull market, it's still behind these indexing strategies for all of the indexing strategies. The S&P 500 has long been a benchmark that all returns are measured against. And so that's why in this video, we want to look at the indexing strategies in an Allianz IUL and compare those with the returns of the S&P 500. There's some other things to consider, like cost of insurance and aspects of expenses that are an insurance policy, but you also need to remember that when you have funds in the S&P 500 directly, you could have years where you might have lost 30%, 20%, 15%, whereas with these indexing strategies, you have that downside protection, and you might have as a guaranteed 0.9% return, maybe a 0% return, or at most a negative 1% return. So that's why the foundation of my wealth building is in these life insurance products, one of them being the Allianz IUL. Let's get into it. The values on this sheet are pulled from that Investopedia. So this column B is based on Investopedia's data on returns for the S&P for the calendar years. We're starting this in 2005. So for context, this is not to the advantage of the S&P. In 2005, we're going into or about to go into a pretty big recession. It's in the middle of what's called the lost decade. So take a lot of this with a grain of salt. It's just a representation of a snapshot of time. The reason I'm starting there is not to advantage these indexing strategies. It's really just because that's how far these index funds, these volatility controlled index funds, go back. The Bloomberg and the PIMCO started out having data in 2005. So in order to have an apples to apples comparison, that's where I'm starting. And as I said, this disadvantages the S&P. So understand that as we go through this. But, honestly, our system sort of revolves around booms and busts. So it could be that these scenarios will happen again. And it's hard to say what exactly will be the long-term performance of these strategies versus the S&P, but I think that these strategies will come out ahead over the long term. So not going to talk through every single number, but you can see that in 2008 the S&P had negative 36.55%, and then when you look at the actual Bloomberg index return, because it's volatility controlled, the index does not go down to that same degree. So you can notice that here. And so this column C is the actual Bloomberg return, and column H is the actual PIMCO index return. So these are all just shorthand for what what I went through on the previous document. So I'm just going to refer to them as the Bloomberg and the PIMCO. And then these other columns are, the select, bonus, classic, and standard. These are the different indexing strategies using that participation rate and that bonus strategy, or the bonus multipliers or addition in the case of classic, and then standard is just participation rate. So these are what the hypothetical returns would be considering for the current day participation rates. And also keep in mind, those participation rates can adjust. The Allianz, in this case, will adjust them up very quickly when the environment is good. They adjust them up, but they could adjust them down in challenging circumstances where options get expensive and where interest rates are low. So those are circumstances where you might see participation rates come down a bit. But generally speaking, they're not going to swing super crazy. It's just they'll come down, a little bit, and then they'll bring them back up as the interest rate environment or the call options improve. So to cover a couple of other time periods was that 2017 year. So in the case of the S&P directly, we're looking at a 21.61% return. But you can see this Bloomberg Select strategy was a 36% return, and this Bloomberg PIMCO Select strategy was 35.44. So even on strong years, the indexing strategies can outperform the S&P. That's not going to be the case on every year. It just depends on what the circumstances are. So you can see that 2019 was more comparative. We've got the Bloomberg Select only coming out slightly ahead, and the PIMCO Select behind the S&P return in 2019. And to look at a different year like 2013, so the S&P did 32.15, but the Bloomberg Select is at 19, and the PIMCO Select is at 18. So it it just goes to show you that these are different than the S&P returns because they're using different strategies. The indexes themselves for the Bloomberg and the PIMCO are volatility controlled. They're moving between uh, large cap equities and uh, bond futures. So it behaves a little bit differently. So it's a monster year in the S&P would not necessarily be a monster year for these index strategies, and vice versa. So some monster years for these index strategies may only be okay returns for the S&P. So with all that said, let's look at how the data actually compares. If you're ready to start implementing net wealth finance in your life, check the video description to book a meeting with us, and we can walk you through whether or not an IUL or a whole life policy or both makes sense for your situation. Again, check the video description, book a meeting with us. We'd love to work with you. All right, so let's jump into this chart. Now, again, I want to caveat that this disadvantages the S&P 500 because in 2022 it was a big negative year. So you can see this is an minus 18%. So 2022 does not look great. It brings down the balance. But just looking at the comparison, still 2021 and in this big bull market, it's still behind these indexing strategies for all of the indexing strategies. Now, the bottom here are the actual returns of the Bloomberg and the PIMCO index. Those are not, before any of the bonus or participation rates. This is just the direct index returns. So those are the lowest. But that's not has nothing to do with the strategies that are implemented in the Allianz IUL. So in comparison with any one of the indexing strategies that we have access to in the Allianz IUL, the S&P comes out behind, even after a very big bull market. So 2021 is a very long bull market, and each of these strategies comes out ahead. And you can see that the overall return is highest on the two select strategies. And then you can see that standard kind of comes in behind it, and there's the different mixtures of the classics. The classics are on the lower side. So over the long term, based on this 2005 to 2022 returns, the select strategies are significantly ahead, and that's why I allocate most of my my funds in my IUL to these select strategies, because I can deal with having a possible negative 1% year, and then look at the returns for the monster years or the big years that are really advantaged. And so over the long term, on average, I feel like they're going to come out ahead. But I still do a smaller subset of the funds in my IUL into the bonus strategy to, one, have an extra index lock opportunity, and two, to have the ability to diversify and still have a little bit of that downside protection. This analysis was recorded as part of a longer video. If you want to check that one out, look at the video description. We'll have a link to the full video, which is around just under 30 minutes. So check the video description to learn more. So this chart that we're looking at here is driven by this table here below, which is using the math of all of these returns above to apply it to this $100,000 initial principal. So based on a $100,000 initial principal, what you can see is the S&P return at the end of 2022, or the balance would be 448,000 versus 703,000 for the Bloomberg Select, almost 704,000, and 715,000 for the PIMCO Select. Past performance is not necessarily going to, make for the future performance, but this is sort of an indicator of what you might be able to expect. And so with that, you can see that these strategies were not as negatively affected between the 2021. These index funds went down. So in 2021, if you look at in 2022, the Bloomberg did have a negative 12%, and the PIMCO had a negative 2.27%. So there was a bad year for those index strategies. However, you don't actually lose that, because when you have the select strategy, your floor is that negative 1%, or these other strategies are either 0% or 0.9%. So that's why these are not as impacted. And this is what I mean by uninterrupted compounding. So you don't step back significantly in any given year when you use these indexing strategies. And the way that they do that is they're buying options, call options against these index funds, and that's how they're able to do that. So if the index goes down, the options will expire worthless, but if the index goes up, they have exposure to those gains. So that's an important factor on how these returns end up not being impacted as much. So you can see that whereas the S&P, even though the starting balance in 2021 was less at 546,000, it went down by almost $100,000 dollars in 2021 to 2022. So that's a big drop. Whereas the Bloomberg Select, it went down $7,000, starting with a higher amount, and the PIMCO Select went down about by $7,000 as well. So that is the real power in using these index strategies, and it's really why I think this is the foundation of my own wealth growth, even more so than my Roth, even more so than my brokerage accounts, even more so than really anything. So it's extremely powerful when you don't have compounding interrupted. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know there's a lot that was covered with deep dives on numbers, but I'm a numbers guy, an engineer. I do data analysis. That's something that I thoroughly enjoy. And I know there's folks that are out there that like that as well. So if you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and give it a like. Comment down below if you have any questions. We'd love to hear from you. And check out some of our other long-form content if you're really trying to learn about how to employ these unconventional strategies to grow long-term wealth and generational wealth. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.